Welcome to Timeless Terrors Volume 5, narrated by Amazon best-selling author Jonathan Dunne. A curated collection of chilling tales from the masters of horror. Inside you will encounter the eerie signal of H.F. Arnold's The Night Wire, the doomed obsession of Edgar Allan Poe's Metzengerstein, and the unsettling antiquarian horrors of H.P. Lovecraft's The Picture in the House. From Ambrose Bierce, experience death that lingers in A Watcher by the Dead, and The Middle Toe of the Right Foot. These stories are old, but their fear is timeless. Dim the lights, silence the world, and listen. Production and narration copyright 2025. Jonathan Dunne. The Picture in the House, written by H.P. Lovecraft, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1921. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025. Jonathan Dunne. Searchers after horror haunt strange, far places. For them are the catacombs of Ptolemais and the carven mausolea of the nightmare countries. They climb to the moonlit towers of ruined Rhine castles and falter down black cobweb steps beneath the scattered stones of forgotten cities in Asia. The haunted wood and the desolate mountain are their shrines, and they linger around the sinister monoliths on uninhabited islands. But the true epicure in the terrible, to whom a new thrill of unutterable ghastliness is the chief end and justification of existence, esteems most of all the ancient, lonely farmhouses of backwoods New England. For there the dark elements of strength, solitude, grotesqueness, and ignorance combine to form the perfection of the hideous. Most horrible of all sights are the little unpainted wooden houses, remote from travelled ways, usually squatted upon some damp, grassy slope, or leaning against some gigantic outcropping of rock. 200 years and more they have leaned or squatted there, while the vines have crawled and the trees have swelled and spread. They are almost hidden now, in lawless luxuriances of green and guardian shrouds of shadow. But the small paned windows still stare shockingly, as if blinking through a lethal stupor, which wards off madness by dulling the memory of unutterable things. In such houses have dwelt generations of strange people, whose like the world has never seen, seized with a gloomy and fanatical belief which exiled them from their kind. Their ancestors sought the wilderness for freedom. There the scions of a conquering race indeed flourished free from the restrictions of their fellows, but cowered in an appalling slavery to the dismal phantasms of their own minds. Divorced from the enlightenment of civilization, the strength of these Puritans turned into singular channels, and in their isolation, morbid self-repression, and struggle for life with relentless nature, there came to them dark furtive traits from the prehistoric depths of their cold, northern heritage. By necessity practical and by philosophy stern, these folk were not beautiful in their sins. Erring as all mortals must, they were forced by their rigid code to seek concealment above all else, so that they came to use less and less taste in what they concealed. Only the silent, sleepy, staring houses in the backwoods can tell all that has lain hidden since the early days. And they are not communicative, being loath to shake off the drowsiness which helps them forget. Sometimes one feels that it would be merciful to tear down these houses, for they must often dream. It was to a time-battered edifice of this description that I was driven one afternoon in November, 1896, by a rain of such chilling copiousness that any shelter was preferable to exposure. I had been travelling for some time amongst the people of the Miskatonic Valley in quest of certain genealogical data, and from the remote, devious, and problematical nature of my course had deemed it convenient to employ a bicycle, despite the lateness of the season. Now I found myself upon an apparently abandoned road which I had chosen as the shortest cut to Arkham, overtaken by the storm at a point far from any town, and confronted with no refuge save the antique and repellent wooden building which blinked with bleared windows from between two huge leafless elms near the foot of a rocky hill. Distant though it was from the remnant of a road, the house none the less impressed me unfavourably the very moment I espied it. Honest, wholesome structures do not stare at travellers so slyly and hauntingly, and in my genealogical researches I had encountered legends of a century before which biased me against places of this kind. Yet the force of the elements was such as to overcome my scruples, and I did not hesitate to wheel my machine up the weedy rise to the closed doors which seemed at once so suggestive and secretive. I had somehow taken it for granted that the house was abandoned, yet as I approached it I was not so sure, for though the walks were indeed overgrown with weeds, they seemed to retain their nature a little too well to argue complete desertion. Therefore, instead of trying the door, I knocked, feeling as I did so a trepidation I could scarcely explain. As I waited on the rough, mossy rock which served as a doorstep, I glanced at the neighbouring windows and the panes of the transom above me, and noticed that although old, rattling, and almost opaque with dirt, they were not broken. The building, then, must still be inhabited, despite its isolation and general neglect. However, my rapping evoked no response, so after repeating the summons I tried the rusty latch and found the door unfastened. Inside was a little vestibule with walls from which the plaster was falling, and through the doorway came a faint but peculiarly hateful odour. I entered, carrying my bicycle, and closed the door behind me. Ahead rose a narrow staircase, flanked by a small door probably leading to the cellar, while to the left and right were closed doors leading to rooms on the ground floor. Leaning my cycle against the wall, I opened the door at the left, and crossed into a small, low-ceiled chamber, but dimly lighted by its two dusty windows, and furnished in the barest and most primitive possible way. It appeared to be a kind of sitting-room, for it had a table and several chairs, and an immense fireplace above which ticked an antique clock on a mantel. Books and papers were very few, and in the prevailing gloom I could not readily discern the titles. What interested me was the uniform air of archaism, as displayed in every visible detail. Most of the houses in this region I had found rich in relics of the past, but here the antiquity was curiously complete, for in all the room I could not discover a single article of definitely post-revolutionary date. Had the furnishings been less humble, the place would have been a collector's paradise. As I surveyed the quaint apartment, I felt an increase in that aversion first excited by the bleak exterior of the house. Just what it was that I feared or loathed I could by no means define, but something in the whole atmosphere seemed redolent of unhallowed age, of unpleasant crudeness, and of secrets which should be forgotten. I felt disinclined to sit down, and wandered about examining the various articles which I had noticed. The first object of my curiosity was a book of medium size lying upon the table and presenting such an antediluvian aspect that I marvelled at beholding it outside a museum or library. It was bound in leather with metal fittings, and was in an excellent state of preservation, being altogether an unusual sort of volume to encounter in an abode so lowly. When I opened it to the title page, my wonder grew very greater, for it proved to be nothing less rare than Pigafetta's account of the Congo region, written in Latin from the notes of the sailor Lopez, and presented at Frankfurt in 1598. I had often heard of this work, with its curious illustrations by the brothers de Bry, hence for a moment forgot my uneasiness in my desire to turn the pages before me. The engravings were indeed interesting, drawn wholly from imagination and careless descriptions, and represented Negroes with white skins and Caucasian features. Nor would I soon have closed the book had not an exceedingly trivial circumstance upset my tired nerves and revived my sensation of disquiet. What annoyed me was merely the persistent way in which the volume tended to fall open, at itself, at plate 12, which represented in gruesome detail a butcher's shop of the cannibal Anzikes. I experienced some shame at my susceptibility to so slight a thing, but the drawing nevertheless disturbed me, especially in connection with some adjacent passages descriptive of Anzique gastronomy. I had turned to a neighbouring shelf and was examining its meagre literary contents, an 18th century Bible, a Pilgrim's Progress of like period, illustrated with grotesque woodcuts and printed by the almanac maker Isaiah Thomas, the rotting bulk of Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana, and a few other books of evidently equal age, when my attention was aroused by the unmistakable sound of walking in the room overhead. At first astonished and startled, considering the lack of response to my recent knocking at the door, I immediately afterward concluded that the walker had just awakened from a sound sleep, and listened with less surprise as the footsteps sounded on the creaking stairs. The tread was heavy, yet seemed to contain a curious quality of cautiousness, a quality which I disliked the more because the tread was heavy. When I had entered the room, I had shut the door behind me. Now, after a moment of silence during which the walker may have been inspecting my bicycle in the hall, I heard a fumbling at the latch and saw the panelled portal swing open again. In the doorway stood a person of such singular appearance that I should have exclaimed aloud but for the restraints of good breeding. Old, white-bearded, and ragged, my host possessed a countenance and physique which inspired equal wonder and respect. His height could not have been less than 6 feet, and despite a general air of age and poverty, he was stout and powerful in proportion. His face, almost hidden by a long beard which grew high on the cheeks, seemed abnormally ruddy and less wrinkled than one might expect, while over a high forehead fell a shock of white hair, little thinned by the years. His blue eyes, though a trifle bloodshot, seemed inexplicably keen and burning. But for his horrible unkemptness, the man would have been as distinguished-looking as he was impressive. This unkemptness, however, made him offensive despite his face and figure. Of what his clothing consisted I could hardly tell, for it seemed to me no more than a mass of tatters surmounting a pair of high, heavy boots, and his lack of cleanliness surpassed description. The appearance of this man and the instinctive fear he inspired prepared me for something like enmity, so that I almost shuddered through surprise and a sense of uncanny incongruity when he motioned me to a chair and addressed me in a thin, weak voice, full of fawning respect and ingratiating hospitality. His speech was very curious, an extreme form of Yankee dialect I had thought long extinct, and I studied it closely as he sat down opposite me for conversation. "Ketched in the rain, be ye?" he greeted. "Glad ye was nigh the house and had the sense to come right in. I calculate I was asleep, else I'd heard ye. I ain't as young as I used to be, and I need a powerful sight of naps nowadays. Travelling for? I hain't seen many folks long this road since they took off the Arkham stage." I replied that I was going to Arkham, and apologized for my rude entry into his domicile, whereupon he continued. "Glad to see you, young sir. New faces is scarce round here, and I ain't got much to cheer me up these days. Guess you hail from Boston, don't ye? I never been there, but I can tell a town man when I see him. We had one for district schoolmaster in '84, but he quit sudden. He seemed to be in an aboundingly good humour, yet to possess those eccentricities which one might guess from his grooming. For some time he rambled on with an almost feverish geniality, when it struck me to ask him how he came by so rare a book as Pigafetta's Regnum Congo. The effect of this volume had not left me, and I felt a certain hesitancy in speaking of it. But curiosity overmastered all the vague fears which had steadily accumulated since my first glimpse of the house. To my relief, the question did not seem an awkward one, for the old man answered freely and volubly. "Oh, that Africa book. Captain Ebenezer Holt traded me that in '68. Him as was kilt in the war." Something about the name of Ebenezer Holt caused me to look up sharply. I had encountered it in my genealogical work, but not in any record since the Revolution. I wondered if my host could help me in the task at which I was labouring, and resolved to ask him about it later on. He continued. "Ebenezer was on a Salem merchantman for years, and picked up a side of queer stuff in every port. He got this in London, I guess. He used to like to buy things at the shops. I was up to his house once, on the hill, trading horses, when I saw this book. I relished the pictures, so he gave it in on a swap. 'Tis a queer book. Here, let me get on my spectacles." The old man fumbled among his rags, producing a pair of dirty and amazingly antique glasses with small octagonal lenses and steel bows. Donning these, he reached for the volume on the table and turned the pages lovingly. "Ebenezer could read a little o' this. 'Tis Latin, but I can't. I had 2 or 3 schoolmasters read me a bit, and Passon Clark, him they say got drowned in the pond. Can you make anything out'n it?" I told him that I could, and translated for his benefit a paragraph near the beginning. If I erred, he was not scholar enough to correct me, for he seemed childishly pleased at my English version. His proximity was becoming rather obnoxious, yet I saw no way to escape without offending him. I was amused at the childish fondness of this ignorant old man for the pictures in a book he could not read, and wondered how much better he could read the few books in English which adorned the room. This revelation of simplicity removed much of the ill-defined apprehension I had felt, and I smiled as my host rambled on. "Queer how pictures can set a body thinking. Take this on here near the front. Have you ever seed trees like that, with big leaves a-flopping over and down? And them men, them can't be black men. They do beat all. Kinder like Injuns, I guess, even if they be in Africa. Some of these here critters look like monkeys, or half monkeys and half men, but I never heard of nothing like this one." Here he pointed to a fabulous creature of the artist, which one might describe as a sort of dragon with the head of an alligator. "But now I'll show ye the best one, over here nigh the middle." The old man's speech grew a trifle thicker, and his eyes assumed a brighter glow, but his fumbling hands, though seemingly clumsier than before, were entirely adequate to their mission. The book fell open, almost of its own accord, and as if from frequent consultation at this place, to the repellent 12th plate, showing a butcher's shop amongst the Anzique cannibals. My sense of restlessness returned, though I did not exhibit it. The especially bizarre thing was that the artist had made his Africans look like white men. The limbs and quarters hanging about the walls of the shop were ghastly, while the butcher with his axe was hideously incongruous. But my host seemed to relish the view as much as I disliked it. "What do you think of this? Ain't never see the like hereabouts, eh? When I see this, I telled Eb Holt, that's suthin' to stir you up and make your blood tickle. When I read in Scripture about slaying, like them Medianides was slew, I kinder think things, but I ain't got no picture of it. Here a body can see all they is to see. I suppose 'tis sinful, but ain't we all born and living in sin? That feller being chopped up gives me a tickle every time I look at him. I have to keep looking at him. See where the butcher cut off his feet. There's his head on that bench, with one arm side of it, and t'other arm on the ground side of the meat block." As the man mumbled on in his shocking ecstasy, the expression on his hairy, speckled face became indescribable. But his face sank rather than mounted. My own sensations can scarcely be recorded. All the terror I had dimly felt before rushed upon me actively and vividly, and I knew that I loathed the ancient and abhorrent creature so near me with an infinite intensity. His madness, or at least his partial perversion, seemed beyond dispute. He was almost whispering now, with a huskiness more terrible than a scream, and I trembled as I listened. "As I says, 'tis queer how pictures sets you thinking. D'ye know, young sir, I'm right sot on this an here. Arter I got the book off Ebb, I used to look at it a lot, especially when I'd heard Passon Clark rant to Sundays in his big wig. Once I tried something funny. Here, young sir, don't get scared. All I done was to look at the picture before I killed the sheep for market. Killing sheep was kinder more fun arter looking at it." The tone of the old man now sank very low, sometimes becoming so faint that his words were hardly audible. I listened to the rain, and to the rattling of the bleared, small-paned windows, and marked a rumbling of approaching thunder quite unusual for the season. Once a terrific flash and peal shook the frail house to its foundations, but the whisperer seemed not to notice it. "Killing sheep was kinder more fun, but you know, 'twa'n't quite satisfying. Queer how a craving gets a holt on ye. As you love the Almighty, young man, don't tell nobody, but I swear to God this picture began to make me hungry for victuals I couldn't raise nor buy. Here, sit still. What's ailing ye?" "I didn't do nothing, only I wondered how 'twould be if I did. They say meat makes blood and flesh and gives ye new life, so I wondered if 'twouldn't make a man live longer and longer if 'twas more the same." But the whisperer never continued. The interruption was not produced by my fright, nor by the rapidly increasing storm amidst whose fury I was presently to open my eyes on a smoky solitude of blackened ruins. It was produced by a very simple though somewhat unusual happening. The open book lay flat between us, with the picture staring repulsively upward. As the old man whispered the words, "More the same," a tiny spattering impact was heard, and something showed on the yellowed paper of the upturned volume. I thought of the rain, and of a leaky roof. But rain is not red. On the butcher's shop of the Anzique cannibals, a small red spattering glistened picturesquely, lending vividness to the horror of the engraving. The old man saw it, and stopped whispering even before my expression of horror made it necessary, saw it, and glanced quickly toward the floor of the room he had left an hour before. I followed his glance, and beheld just above us on the loose plaster of the ancient ceiling a large, irregular spot of wet crimson, which seemed to spread even as I viewed it. I did not shriek or move, but merely shut my eyes. A moment later came the titanic thunderbolt of thunderbolts, blasting that accursed house of unutterable secrets and bringing the oblivion which alone saved my mind. This has been The Picture in the House, written by H.P. Lovecraft, narrated for you by J.Dunne. Original year of publication, 1921. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025. J.Dunne. A Watcher by the Dead, written by Ambrose Bierce. Narrated for you by J.Dunne. Original year of publication, 1889. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025, J.Dunne. 1. In an upper room of an unoccupied dwelling in the part of San Francisco known as North Beach, lay the body of a man under a sheet. The hour was near 9 in the evening. The room was dimly lighted by a single candle. Although the weather was warm, the two windows, contrary to the custom which gives the dead plenty of air, were closed and the blinds drawn down. The furniture of the room consisted of but 3 pieces: an armchair, a small reading stand supporting the candle, and a long kitchen table supporting the body of the man. All these, as also the corpse, seemed to have been recently brought in, for an observer, had there been one, would have seen that all were free from dust, whereas everything else in the room was pretty thickly coated with it, and there were cobwebs in the angles of the walls. Under the sheet the outlines of the body could be traced, even the features, these having that unnaturally sharp definition which seems to belong to faces of the dead, but is really characteristic of those only that have been wasted by disease. From the silence of the room one would rightly have inferred that it was not in front of the house, facing a street. It really faced nothing but a high breast of rock, the rear of the building being set into a hill. As a neighbouring church clock was striking 9 with an indolence which seemed to imply such an indifference to the flight of time that one could hardly help wondering why it took the trouble to strike at all. The single door of the room was opened and a man entered, advancing toward the body. As he did so, the door closed, apparently of its own volition. There was a grating, as of a key turned with difficulty, and the snap of the lock bolt as it shot into its socket. A sound of retiring footsteps in the passage outside ensued, and the man was to all appearance a prisoner. Advancing to the table, he stood a moment looking down at the body. Then, with a slight shrug of the shoulders, walked over to one of the windows and hoisted the blind. The darkness outside was absolute. The panes were covered with dust, but by wiping this away he could see that the window was fortified with strong iron bars, crossing it within a few inches of the glass, and embedded in the masonry on each side. He examined the other window. It was the same. He manifested no great curiosity in the matter, did not even so much as raise the sash. If he was a prisoner, he was apparently a tractable one. Having completed his examination of the room, he seated himself in the armchair, took a book from his pocket, drew the stand with his candle alongside, and began to read. The man was young, not more than 30, dark in complexion, smooth-shaven, with brown hair. His face was thin and high-nosed, with a broad forehead and a firmness of the chin and jaw which is said by those having it to denote resolution. The eyes were grey and steadfast, not moving except with definitive purpose. They were now for the greater part of the time fixed upon his book, but he occasionally withdrew them and turned them to the body on the table, not, apparently, from any dismal fascination which under such circumstances it might be supposed to exercise upon even a courageous person, nor with a conscious rebellion against the contrary influence which might dominate a timid one. He looked at it as if in his reading he had come upon something recalling him to a sense of his surroundings. Clearly, this watcher by the dead was discharging his trust with intelligence and composure, as became him. After reading for perhaps a half-hour, he seemed to come to the end of a chapter and quietly laid away the book. He then rose and, taking the reading stand from the floor, carried it into a corner of the room near one of the windows, lifted the candle from it and returned to the empty fireplace before which he had been sitting. A moment later he walked over to the body on the table, lifted the sheet and turned it back from the head, exposing a mass of dark hair and a thin face-cloth, beneath which the features showed with even sharper definition than before. Shading his eyes by interposing his free hand between them and the candle, He stood looking at his motionless companion with a serious and tranquil regard. Satisfied with his inspection, he pulled the sheet over the face again and, returning to the chair, took some matches off the candlestick, put them in the side pocket of his sack coat and sat down. He then lifted the candle from its socket and looked at it critically, as if calculating how long it would last. It was barely 2 inches long. In another hour he would be in darkness. He replaced it in the candlestick and blew it out. 2. In a physician's office in Kearney Street, 3 men sat about a table, drinking punch and smoking. It was late in the evening, almost midnight, indeed, and there had been no lack of punch. The gravest of the 3, Dr. Helberson, was the host. It was in his rooms they sat. He was about 30 years of age. The others were even younger. All were physicians. "The superstitious awe with which the living regard the dead," said Dr. Helberson, "is hereditary and incurable. One needs no more be ashamed of it than of the fact that he inherits, for example, an incapacity for mathematics, or a tendency to lie." The others laughed. "Oughtn't a man to be ashamed to lie?" asked the youngest of the 3, who was in fact a medical student not yet graduated. "My dear Harper, I said nothing about that. The tendency to lie is one thing, lying is another." "But do you think," said the 3rd man, "that this superstitious feeling, this fear of the dead, reasonless as we know it to be, is universal? I am myself not conscious of it." "Oh, but it is in your system for all that," replied Helberson. "It needs only the right conditions, what Shakespeare calls the Confederate season, to manifest itself in some very disagreeable way that will open your eyes. Physicians and soldiers are, of course, more nearly free from it than others." "Physicians and soldiers? Why don't you add hangmen and headsmen? Let us have in all the assassin classes." "No, my dear Mancher. The juries will not let the public executioners acquire sufficient familiarity with death to be altogether unmoved by it." Young Harper, who had been helping himself to a fresh cigar at the sideboard, resumed his seat. "What would you consider conditions under which any man or woman born would become insupportably conscious of his share of our common weakness in this regard?" he asked, rather verbosely. "Well, I should say that if a man were locked up all night with a corpse, alone, in a dark room of a vacant house, with no bed covers to pull over his head, and lived through it without going altogether mad, he might justly boast himself not of woman born, nor yet like Macduff, a product of Caesarean section." "I thought you never would finish piling up conditions," said Harper. "But I know a man who is neither a physician nor a soldier who'll accept them all, for any stake you like to name." "Who is he?" "His name is Jarrett, a stranger here. Comes from my town in New York. I have no money to back him, but he will back himself with loads of it." "How do you know that?" "He would rather bet than eat. As for fear, I dare say he thinks it's some cutaneous disorder, or possibly a particular kind of religious heresy." "What does he look like?" Helberson was evidently becoming interested. "Like Mancher here. Might be his twin brother." "I accept the challenge," said Helberson promptly. "Awfully obliged to you for the compliment, I'm sure," drawled Mancher, who was growing sleepy. "Can't I get into this?" "Not against me," Helberson said. "I don't want your money." "All right," said Mancher. "I'll be the corpse." The others laughed. The outcome of this crazy conversation we have seen. 3. In extinguishing his meagre allowance of candle, Mr. Jarrett's object was to preserve it against some unforeseen need. He may have thought, too, or half thought, that the darkness would be no worse at one time than another, and if the situation became unsupportable, it would be better to have a means of relief, or even release. At any rate, It was wise to have a little reserve of light, even if only to enable him to look at his watch. No sooner had he blown out the candle and set it on the floor at his side than he settled himself comfortably in the armchair, leaned back and closed his eyes, hoping and expecting to sleep. In this he was disappointed. He had never in his life felt less sleepy, and in a few minutes he gave up the attempt. But what could he do? He could not go groping about in absolute darkness at the risk of bruising himself, at the risk, too, of blundering against the table and rudely disturbing the dead. We all recognize their right to lie at rest, with immunity from all that is harsh and violent. Jarrett almost succeeded in making himself believe that considerations of this kind restrained him from risking the collision and fixed him to the chair. While thinking of this matter, he fancied that he heard a faint sound in the direction of the table. What kind of sound he could hardly have explained. He did not turn his head. Why should he, in the darkness? But he listened. Why should he not? And listening, he grew giddy and grasped the arms of the chair for support. There was a strange ringing in his ears. His head seemed bursting. His chest was oppressed by the constriction of his clothing. He wondered why it was so, and whether these were symptoms of fear. Then, with a long and strong expiration, his chest appeared to collapse, and with the great gasp with which he refilled his exhausted lungs, the vertigo left him, and he knew that so intently had he listened that he had held his breath almost to suffocation. The revelation was vexatious. He arose, pushed away the chair with his foot, and strode to the centre of the room. But one does not stride far in darkness. He began to grope, and finding the wall, followed it to an angle, turned, followed it past the two windows, and there, in another corner, came into violent contact with the reading stand, overturning it. It made a clatter that startled him. He was annoyed. "How the devil could I have forgotten where it was?" he muttered, and groped his way along the third wall to the fireplace. "I must put things to rights," said he, feeling the floor for the candle. Having recovered that, he lighted it and instantly turned his eyes to the table where, naturally, nothing had undergone any change. The reading stand lay unobserved upon the floor. He had forgotten to put it to rights. He looked all about the room, dispersing the deeper shadows by movements of the candle in his hand, and crossing over to the door, tested it by turning and pulling the knob with all his strength. It did not yield, and this seemed to afford him a certain satisfaction. Indeed, he secured it more firmly by a bolt which he had not before observed. Returning to his chair, he looked at his watch. It was 9:30. With a start of surprise, he held the watch at his ear. It had not stopped. The candle was now visibly shorter. He again extinguished it, placing it on the floor at his side as before. Mr. Jarrett was not at his ease. He was distinctly dissatisfied with his surroundings, and with himself for being so. "What have I to fear?" he thought. "This is ridiculous and disgraceful. I will be not so great a fool." But courage does not come of saying, "I will be courageous," nor of recognizing its appropriateness to the occasion. The more Jarrett condemned himself, the more reason he gave himself for condemnation. The greater the number of variations which he played upon the simple theme of the harmlessness of the dead, the more insupportable grew the discord of his emotions. "What?" he cried aloud in the anguish of his spirit. "What? Shall I, who have not a shade of superstition in my nature, I, who have no belief in immortality, I who know, and never more clearly than now, that the afterlife is the dream of a desire, shall I lose at once my bet, my honour, and my self-respect, perhaps my reason, because certain savage ancestors dwelling in caves and burrows conceived the monstrous notion that the dead walk by night, that—" Distinctly, unmistakably, Mr. Jarrett heard behind him a light, soft sound of footfalls, deliberate, regular, successively nearer. 4. Just before daybreak in the next morning, Dr. Helberson and his young friend Harper were driving slowly through the streets of North Beach in the doctor's coupe. "Have you still the confidence of youth and the courage or stolidity of your friend?" said the elder man. "Do you believe that I have lost this wager?" "I know you have," replied the other, with enfeebling emphasis. "Well, upon my soul, I hope so." It was spoken earnestly, almost solemnly. There was a silence for a few moments. "Harper," the doctor resumed, looking very serious in the shifting half-lights that entered the carriage as they passed the street lamps, "I don't feel altogether comfortable about this business. If your friend had not irritated me by the contemptuous manner in which he treated my doubt of his endurance, a purely physical quality, and by the cool incivility of his suggesting that the corpse be that of a physician, I should not have got on with it. If anything should happen, we are ruined, as I fear we deserve to be." "What can happen? Even if the matter should be taking a serious turn, of which I'm not at all afraid, Mancher has only to resurrect himself and explain matters with a genuine subject from the dissecting room, or one of your late patients. It might be different. With a genuine subject from the dissecting room, or one of your late patients, it might be different." Dr. Mancher, then, had been as good as his promise. He was the corpse. Dr. Helberson was silent for a long time, as the carriage, at a snail's pace, crept along the same street it had travelled 2 or 3 times already. Presently he spoke. "Well, let us hope that Mancher, if he has to rise from the dead, has been discreet about it. A mistake that might make matters worse instead of better." "Yes," said Harper. "Jarrett would kill him. But, Doctor," looking at his watch as the carriage passed a gas lamp, "it is nearly 4 o'clock at last." A moment later the two had quitted the vehicle, and were walking briskly toward the long unoccupied house belonging to the doctor, in which they had immured Mr. Jarrett, in accordance with the terms of the mad wager. As they neared it, they met a man running. "Can you help me?" he cried, suddenly checking his speed. "Where can I find a doctor?" "What's the matter?" Helberson asked, non-committal. "Go and see for yourself," said the man, resuming his running. They hastened on. Arrived at the house, they saw several persons entering in haste and excitement. In some of the dwellings nearby and across the way, the chamber windows were thrown up, showing a protrusion of heads. All heads were asking questions, none heeding the questions of the others. A few of the windows with closed blinds were illuminated. The inmates of those rooms were dressing to come down. Exactly opposite the door of the house that they saw at a street lamp threw a yellow, insufficient light upon the scene, seeming to say that it could disclose a good deal more if it wished. Harper paused at the door, and laid a hand upon his companion's arm. "It is all up with us, Doctor," he said in extreme agitation, which contrasted strangely with his free and easy words. "The game has gone against us all. Let us not go in there. I'm for lying low." "I'm a physician," said Dr. Helberson calmly. "There may be need of one." They mounted the doorsteps and were about to enter. The door was open. The street lamp opposite lighted the passage into it, which it opened. It was full of men. Some had ascended the stairs at the farther end, and, denied admittance above, waited for better fortune. All were talking, none listening. Suddenly on the upper landing there was a great commotion. A man had sprung out of a door and was breaking away from those endeavouring to detain him. Down through the mass of affrighted idlers he came, pushing them aside, flattening them against the wall on one side, or compelling them to cling to the rail on the other, clutching them by the throat, striking them savagely, thrusting them back down the stairs and walking over the fallen. His clothing was in disorder. He was without a hat. His eyes, wild and restless, had in them something more terrifying than his apparently superhuman strength. His face, smooth-shaven, was bloodless. His hair, frost-white. As the crowd at the foot of the stairs, having more freedom, fell away to let him pass, Harper sprang forward. "Jarrett! Jarrett!" he cried. Dr. Hilberson seized Harper by the collar and dragged him back. The man looked into their faces without seeming to see them and sprang through the door, down the steps into the street and away. A stout policeman, who had inferior success in conquering his way down the stairway, followed a moment later and started in pursuit. All the heads in the windows, those of women and children now, screaming in guidance. The stairway being now partly cleared, most of the crowd having rushed down to the street to observe the flight and pursuit, Dr. Hilberson mounted to the landing, followed by Harper. At a door in the upper passage, an officer denied them admittance. "We are physicians," said the doctor, and they passed in. The room was full of men, dimly seen, crowded by a table. The newcomers edged their way forward and looked over the shoulders of those in the front rank. Upon the table, the lower limbs covered with a sheet, lay the body of a man, brilliantly illuminated by the beam of a bull's-eye lantern held by a policeman standing at the feet. The others, excepting those near the head, the officer himself, all were in darkness. The face of the body showed yellow, repulsive, horrible. The eyes were partly opened and upturned, and the jaw fallen. Traces of froth defiled the lips, the chin, the cheeks. A tall man, evidently a doctor, bent over the body with his hand thrust under the shirt front. He withdrew it and placed 2 fingers in the open mouth. "This man has been about 6 hours dead," said he. "It is a case for the coroner." He drew a card from his pocket, handed it to the officer, and made his way toward the door. "Clear the room! Out, all!" said the officer, sharply, and the body disappeared as if it had been snatched away, as, shifting the lantern, he flashed its beam of light here and there against the faces of the crowd. The effect was amazing. The men, blinded, confused, almost terrified, made a tumultuous rush for the door, pushing, crowding, and tumbling over one another as they fled, like the hosts of night before the shafts of Apollo. Upon the struggling, trampling mass the officer poured his light without pity and without cessation. Caught in the current, Hilberson and Harper were swept out of the room and cascaded down the stairs into the street. "Good God, Doctor! Did I not tell you that Jarrett would kill him?" said Harper, as soon as they were clear of the crowd. "I believe you did," replied the other, without apparent emotion. They walked on in silence, block after block. Against the greying east, the dwellings of the hill tribes showed in silhouette. The familiar milk wagon was already astir in the streets. The baker's man would soon come upon the scene. The newspaper carrier was abroad in the land. "It strikes me, youngster," said Hilberson, "that you and I have been having too much of the morning air lately. It is unwholesome. We need a change. What do you say to a tour in Europe?" "When?" "I'm not particular. I should suppose at 4 o'clock this afternoon would be early enough." "I'll meet you at the boat," said Harper. 7 years afterward, these 2 men sat upon a bench in Madison Square, New York, in familiar conversation. Another man, who had been observing them for some time, himself unobserved, approached and, courteously lifting his hat from locks as white as frost, said, "I beg your pardon, gentlemen, but when you have killed a man by coming to life, it is best to change clothes with him, and at the first opportunity make a break for liberty." Hilberson and Harper exchanged significant glances. They were obviously amused. The former then looked the stranger kindly in the eye and replied, "That has always been my plan. I entirely agree with you. As to its advent—" He stopped suddenly, rose, and went white. He stared at the man, open-mouthed. He trembled visibly. "Ah," said the stranger, "I see that you are indisposed, Doctor. If you cannot treat yourself, Dr. Harper can do something for you, I'm sure." "Who the devil are you?" said Harper bluntly. The stranger came nearer, and, bending toward them, said in a whisper, "I call myself Jarrett sometimes, but I don't mind telling you, for old friendship, that I am Dr. William Mancher." The revelation brought Harper to his feet. "Mancha!" he cried, and Halberson added, "It is true, by God!" "Yes," said the stranger, smiling vaguely. "It is true enough, no doubt." He hesitated and seemed to be trying to recall something, then began humming a popular air. He had apparently forgotten their presence. "Look here, Mancha," said the elder of the two. "Tell us just what occurred that night. To Jarrett, you know." "Oh, yes, about Jarrett," said the other. "It's odd I should have neglected to tell you. I tell it so often. You see, I knew, by overhearing him talking to himself, that he was pretty badly frightened, so I couldn't resist the temptation to come to life and have a bit of fun out of him. I couldn't really. That was all right, though certainly I did not think he would take it so seriously. I did not truly. And afterward, well, it was a tough job changing places with him. And then, damn you, you didn't let me out." Nothing could exceed the ferocity with which these last words were delivered. Both men stepped back in alarm. "We? Why?" Halberson stammered, losing his self-possession utterly. "We'd nothing to do with it." "Didn't I say you were Doctors Hellborn and Sharper?" inquired the man, laughing. "My name is Halberson, yes, and this gentleman is Mr. Harper," replied the former, reassured by the laugh. "But we are not physicians now. We are, well, hang it, old man, we are gamblers." And that was the truth. A very good profession, very good indeed. And, by the way, I hope Sharper here paid over Jarrett's money like an honest stakeholder. A very good and honourable profession, he repeated, thoughtfully, moving carelessly away. But I stick to the old one. I am High Supreme Medical Officer of the Bloomingdale Asylum. It is my duty to cure the superintendent. This has been A Watcher by the Dead, written by Ambrose Bierce. Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1889. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025, Jonathan Dunne. Metzengerstein, written by Edgar Allan Poe. Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1832. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025, Jonathan Dunne. Pestis, iram vivos, moriens tua mors ero. Martin Luther. Horror and fatality have been stalking abroad in all ages. Why then give a date to this story I have to tell? Let it suffice to say that at the period of which I speak, there existed in the interior of Hungary a settled although hidden belief in the doctrines of the metempsychosis. Of the doctrines themselves, that is, of their falsity or of their probability, I say nothing. I assert, however, that much of our incredulity, as La Bruyère says of all our unhappiness, vient de ne pouvoir entrer seul. But there are some points in the Hungarian superstition which were fast verging to absurdity. They, the Hungarians, differed very essentially from their Eastern authorities. For example, the soul, said the former. I give the words of an acute and intelligent Parisian, ne demeure qu'une seule fois, donne encore son semble, au reste. Un cheval, un chien, un homme même n'est que la ressemblance pure. tangibles de ces animaux. The families of Berlifitzing and Metzengerstein had been at variance for centuries. Never before were two houses so illustrious, mutually embittered by hostility so deadly. The origin of this enmity seems to be found in the words of an ancient prophecy. A lofty name shall have a fearful fall when, as the rider over his horse, the mortality of Metzengerstein shall triumph over the immortality of Berlifitzing. To be sure, the words themselves had little or no meaning, but more trivial causes have given rise, and that no long while ago, to consequences equally eventful. Besides, the estates, which were contiguous, had long exercised a rival influence in the affairs of a busy government. Moreover, near neighbours had seldom friends, and the inhabitants of the castle Berlifitzing might look, from their lofty buttresses, into the very windows of the palace Metzengerstein. Least of all had the more than feudal magnificence thus discovered a tendency to allay the irritable feelings of the less ancient and less wealthy Berlifitzings. What wonder then that the words, however silly, of that prediction should have succeeded in setting and keeping at variance two families already predisposed to quarrel by every instigation of hereditary jealousy. The prophecy seemed to imply, if it implied anything, a final triumph on the part of the already more powerful house, and was of course remembered with the more bitter animosity by the weaker and less influential. Wilhelm, Count Berlifitzing, although loftily descended, was at the epoch of this narrative an infirm and doting old man, remarkable for nothing but an inordinate and inveterate personal antipathy to the family of his rival, and so passionate a love of horses and of hunting, that neither bodily infirmity, great age, nor mental incapacity prevented his daily participation in the dangers of the chase. Frederick, Baron Metzengerstein, was on the other hand not yet of age. His father, the minister G., died young. His mother, the Lady Mary, followed him quickly after. Frederick was at that time in his 15th year. In a city 15 years are no long period. A child may be still a child in his third lustrum, but in a wilderness, in so magnificent a wilderness as that old principality, 15 years have a far deeper meaning. From some peculiar circumstances attending the administration of his father, the young baron, at the decease of the former, entered immediately upon his vast possessions. Such estates were seldom held before by a nobleman of Hungary. His castles were without number. The chief in point of splendour and extent was the Chateau Metzengerstein. The boundary line of his dominions was never clearly defined, but his principal park embraced a circuit of 50 miles. Upon the succession of a proprietor so young, with a character so well known, to a fortune so unparalleled, little speculation was afloat in regarding to his probable course of conduct, and indeed for the space of 3 days the behaviour of the heir out-Heroded Herod, and fairly surpassed the expectations of his most enthusiastic admirers. Shameful debaucheries, flagrant treacheries, unheard-of atrocities gave his trembling vassals quickly to understand that no servile submission on their part, no punctilious of conscience on his own, were thenceforth to prove any security against the remorseless fangs of a petty Caligula. On the night of the 4th day, the stables of the castle Berlifitzing were discovered to be on fire, and the unanimous opinion of the neighbourhood added the crime of the incendiary to the already hideous list of the baron's misdemeanours and enormities. But during the tumult occasioned by this occurrence, the young nobleman himself sat apparently buried in meditation, in a vast and desolate upper apartment of the family palace of Metzengerstein. The rich, although faded tapestry hangings which swung gloomily upon the walls represented the shadowy and majestic forms of 1,000 illustrious ancestors. Here, rich ermined priests and pontifical dignitaries, familiarly seated with the autocrat and the sovereign, put a veto on the wishes of a temporal king, or restrained with the fiat of papal supremacy, the rebellious sceptre of the archenemy. There, the dark, tall statues of the princes Metzengerstein, their muscular war coursers plunging over the carcasses of fallen foes, startled the steadiest nerves with their vigorous expression. And here again, the voluptuous and swan-like figures of the dames of days gone by floated away in the mazes of an unreal dance to the strains of imaginary melody. But as the Baron listened, or affected to listen, to the gradually increasing uproar in the stables of Berlifitzing, or perhaps pondered upon some more novel, some more decided act of audacity, his eyes became unwittingly riveted to the figure of an enormous and unnaturally coloured horse, represented in the tapestry as belonging to a Saracen ancestor of the family of his rival. The horse itself, in the foreground of the design, stood motionless and statue-like, while further back its discomfited rider perished by the dagger of a Metzengerstein. On Frederick's lip arose a fiendish expression, as he became aware of the direction which his glance had, without his consciousness, assumed. Yet he did not remove it. On the contrary, he could by no means account for the overwhelming anxiety which appeared falling like a pall upon his senses. It was with difficulty that he reconciled his dreamy and incoherent feelings with the certainty of being awake. The longer he gazed, the more absorbing became the spell. The more impossible did it appear that he could ever withdraw his glance. It was with difficulty that he reconciled his dreamy and incoherent feelings with the certainty of being awake. The longer he gazed, the more absorbing became the spell. The more impossible did it appear that he could ever withdraw his glance from the fascination of that tapestry. But the tumult, without becoming suddenly more violent, with a compulsory exertion he diverted his attention to the glare of ruddy light thrown full by the flaming stables upon the windows of the apartment. The action, however, was but momentary. His gaze returned mechanically to the wall. To his extreme horror and astonishment, the head of the gigantic steed had, in the meantime, altered its position. The neck of the animal, before arched as if in compassion over the prostrate body of its lord, was now extended at full length in the direction of the Baron. The eyes, before invisible, now wore an energetic and human expression, while they gleamed with a fiery and unusual red. And the distended lips of the apparently enraged horse left in full view his gigantic and disgusting teeth. Stupefied with terror, the young nobleman tottered to the door. As he threw it open, a flash of red light, streaming far into the chamber, flung his shadow with a clear outline against the quivering tapestry, and he shuddered to perceive that shadow, as he staggered a while upon the threshold, assuming the exact position, and precisely filling up the contour of the relentless and triumphant murderer of the Saracen Berlifitzing. To enlighten the depression of his spirits, the Baron hurried into the open air. At the principal gate of the palace he encountered 3 equerries. With much difficulty, and at the imminent peril of their lives, they were restraining the convulsive plunges of a gigantic and fiery-coloured horse. "Whose horse? Where did you get him?" demanded the youth, in a querulous and husky tone of voice, as he became instantly aware that the mysterious steed in the tapestried chamber was the very counterpart of the furious animal before his eyes. "He is your own property, sire," replied one of the equerries. "At least he is claimed by no other owner. We caught him flying, all smoking and foaming with rage, from the burning stables of the Castle Berlifitzing. Supposing him to have belonged to the old Count's stud of foreign horses, we led him back as an estray, but the grooms there disclaim any title to the creature, which is strange, since he bears evident marks of having made a narrow escape from the flames. The letters WVB are also branded very distinctly on his forehead," interrupted a second equerry. "I suppose them, of course, to be the initials of Wilhelm von Berlifitzing, but all at the castle are positive in denying any knowledge of the horse." "Extremely singular," said the young Baron, with a musing air and apparently unconscious of the meaning of his words. He is, as you say, a remarkable horse, a prodigious horse, although, as you very justly observe, of a suspicious and unattractable character. Let him be mine. However, he added after a pause, perhaps a rider like Frederick of Metzengerstein may tame even the devil from the stables of Berlifitzing. You are mistaken, my lord. The horse, as I think we mentioned, is not from the stables of the Count. If such had been the case, we know our duty better than to bring him into the presence of a noble of your family. True, observed the Baron dryly, and at that instant a page of the bedchamber came from the palace with a heightened colour and a precipitate step. He whispered into his master's ear an account of the sudden disappearance of a small portion of the tapestry in an apartment which he designated, entering at the same time into particulars of a minute and circumstantial character. But from the low tone of voice in which these latter were communicated, nothing escaped to gratify the excited curiosity of the equerries. The young Friedrich, during the conference, seemed agitated by a variety of emotions. He soon, however, recovered his composure, and an expression of determined malignancy settled upon his countenance, as he gave peremptory orders that a certain chamber should be immediately locked up and the key placed in his own possession. "Have you heard of the unhappy death of the old hunter Berlifitzing?" said one of his vassals to the Baron, as, after the departure of the page, the huge steed, which that nobleman had adopted as his own, plunged and curveted with redoubled fury down the long avenue which extended from the chateau to the stables of Metzengerstein. "No," said the Baron, turning abruptly toward the speaker. "Dead, say you?" "It is indeed true, my lord, and to a noble of your name will be, I imagine, no unwelcome intelligence." A rapid smile shot over the countenance of the listener. "How died he?" "In his rash exertions to rescue a favourite portion of his hunting stud, he has himself perished miserably in the flames." "Indeed!" ejaculated the Baron, as if slowly and deliberately impressed with the truth of some exciting idea. "Indeed," repeated the vassal. "Shocking," said the youth calmly, and turned quietly into the chateau. From this date a marked alteration took place in the outward demeanour of the dissolute young Baron Friedrich von Metzengerstein. Indeed, his behaviour disappointed every expectation, and proved little in accordance with the views of many a manoeuvring mamma, while his habits and manner, still less than formerly, offered anything congenial with those of the neighbouring aristocracy. He was never to be seen beyond the limits of his own domain, and, in his wide and social world, was utterly companionless, unless indeed that unnatural, impetuous, and fiery-coloured horse, which he henceforward continually bestrode, had any mysterious right to the title of his friend. Numerous invitations on the part of the neighbourhood for a long time, however, periodically came in. "Will the Baron honour our festivals with his presence? Will the Baron join us in a hunting of the boar? Metzengerstein does not hunt. Metzengerstein will not attend," were the haughty and laconic answers. These repeated insults were not to be endured by an imperious nobility. Such invitations became less cordial, less frequent. In time they ceased altogether. The widow of the unfortunate Count Berlifitzing was even heard to express a hope that the Baron might be at home when he did not wish to be at home, since he disdained the company of his equals, and ride when he did not wish to ride, since he preferred the society of a horse. This, to be sure, was a very silly explosion of hereditary pique, and merely proved how singularly unmeaning our sayings are apt to become when we desire to be unusually energetic. The charitable, nevertheless, attributed the alteration in the conduct of the young nobleman to the natural sorrow of his son for the untimely loss of his parents, forgetting, however, his atrocious and reckless behaviour during the short period immediately succeeding that bereavement. Some there were, indeed, who suggested a too haughty idea of self-consequence and dignity. Others again, among them may be mentioned the family physician, did not hesitate in speaking of morbid melancholy and hereditary ill health, while dark hints of a more equivocal nature were current among the multitude. Indeed, the Baron's perverse attachment to his lately acquired charger, an attachment which seemed to attain new strength from every fresh example of the animal's ferocious and demon-like propensities, at length became, in the eyes of all reasonable men, a hideous and unnatural fervour. In the glare of noon, at the dead hour of night, in sickness or in health, in calm or in tempest, the young Metzengerstein seemed riveted to the saddle of that colossal horse, whose intractable audacities so well accorded with his own spirit. There were circumstances, moreover, which, coupled with late events, gave an unearthly and portentous character to the mania of the rider, and to the capabilities of the steed. The space passed over in a single leap had been accurately measured, and was found to exceed by an astounding difference the wildest expectations of the most imaginative. The Baron, besides, had no particular name for the animal, although all the rest in his collection were distinguished by characteristic appellations. His stable, too, was appointed at a distance from the rest, with regard to grooming and other necessary offices. None but the owner in person had ventured to officiate, or even to enter the enclosure of that particular stall. It was also to be observed that although the 3 grooms who had caught the steed as he fled from the conflagration at Berlifitzing had succeeded in arresting his course by means of a chain bridle and noose, yet no one of the 3 could with certainty affirm that he had, during that dangerous struggle, or at any period thereafter, actually placed his hand upon the body of the beast. Instances of peculiar intelligence in the demeanour of a noble and high-spirited horse are not to be supposed capable of exciting unreasonable attention, especially among men who, daily trained to the labours of the chase, might appear well acquainted with the sagacity of a horse. But there were certain circumstances which intruded themselves perforce upon the most sceptical and phlegmatic, and it is said there were times when the animal caused the gaping crowd who'd stood around to recoil in horror from the deep and impressive meaning of his terrible stamp. Times when the young Metzengerstein turned pale and shrunk away from the rapid and searching expression of his earnest and human-looking eye. Among all the retinue of the Baron, however, none were found to doubt the ardour of that extraordinary affection which existed on the part of the young nobleman for the fiery qualities of his horse. At least, none but an insignificant and misshapen little page, whose deformities were in everybody's way, and whose opinions were of the least possible importance. He, if his ideas are worth mentioning at all, had the effrontery to assert that his master never vaulted into the saddle without an unaccountable and almost imperceptible shudder, and that, upon his return from every long continued and habitual ride, an expression of triumphant malignity distorted every muscle in his countenance. One tempestuous night, Metzengerstein, awaking from a heavy slumber, descended like a maniac from his chamber, and, mounting in hot haste, bounded away into the mazes of the forest. An occurrence so common attracted no particular attention, but his return was looked for with intense anxiety on the part of his domestics, when, after some hours' absence, the stupendous and magnificent battlements of the Chateau Metzengerstein were discovered crackling and rocking to their very foundation, under the influence of a dense and livid mass of ungovernable fire. As the flames, when first seen, had already made so terrible a progress that all efforts to save any portion of the building were evidently futile, the astonished neighbourhood stood idly around in silent and pathetic wonder. But a new and fearful object soon riveted the attention of the multitude, and proved how much more intense is the excitement wrought in the feelings of a crowd by the contemplation of human agony, than that brought about by the most appalling spectacles of inanimate matter. Up the long avenue of aged oaks which led from the forest to the main entrance of the Chateau Metzengerstein, a steed, bearing an unbonneted and disordered rider, was seen leaping with an impetuosity which outstripped the very demon of the tempest. The career of the horseman was indisputably, on his own part, uncontrollable. The agony of his countenance, the convulsive struggle of his frame, gave evidence of superhuman exertion, but no sound, save a solitary shriek, escaped from his lacerated lips, which were bitten through and through in the intensity of terror. One instant, and the clattering of hoofs resounded sharply and shrilly above the roaring of the flames and the shrieking of the winds. Another, and clearing at a single plunge the gateway and the moat, the steed bounded far up the tottering staircases of the palace, and with its rider disappeared amid the whirlwind of chaotic fire. The fury of the tempest immediately died away, and a dead calm sullenly succeeded. A white flame still enveloped the building, like a shroud, and, streaming far away into the quiet atmosphere, shot forth a glare of preternatural light, while a cloud of smoke settled heavily over the battlements of the distinct colossal figure of a horse. This has been Metzengerstein, written by Edgar Allan, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1832. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2025. Jonathan Dunne. The middle toe of the right foot. Written by Ambrose Bierce. Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1890. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025. Jonathan Dunne. One. It is well known that the old Manton house is haunted. In all the rural district near about, and even in the town of Marshall, a mile away, not one person of unbiased mind entertains a doubt of it. Incredulity is confined to those opinionated persons who will be called cranks as soon as the useful word shall have penetrated the intellectual domain of the Marshall advance. The evidence that the house is haunted is of two kinds: the testimony of disinterested witnesses who have had ocular proof, and that of the house itself. The former may be disregarded and ruled out, on any of the various grounds of objection which may be urged against it by the ingenious, but facts within the observation of all are material and controlling. In the first place, the Manton house has been unoccupied by mortals for more than 10 years, and with its outbuildings is slowly falling into decay, a circumstance which in itself the judicious will hardly venture to ignore. It stands a little way off the loneliest reach of the Marshall and Harriston Road, in an opening which was once a farm, and is still disfigured with strips of rotting fence, and half covered with brambles, overrunning a stony and sterile soil long acquainted with the plough. The house itself is in tolerably good condition, though badly weather-stained and in dire need of attention from the glazier, the smaller male population of the region having attested in the manner of its kind its disapproval of dwelling without dwellers. It is 2 stories in height, nearly square, its front pierced by a single doorway flanked on each side by a window boarded up to the very top. Corresponding windows above, not protected, serve to admit light and rain to the rooms of the upper floor. Grass and weeds grow pretty rankly all about, and a few shade trees, somewhat the worst for wind, and leaning all in one direction, seem to be making a concerted effort to run away. In short, as the Marshall Town humorist explained in the columns of the Advance, the proposition that the Manton house is badly haunted is the only logical conclusion from the premises. The fact that in this dwelling Mr. Manton thought it expedient one night some 10 years ago to rise and cut the throats of his wife and 2 children, removing at once to another part of the country, has no doubt done its share in directing public attention to the fitness of the place for supernatural phenomena. To this house, one summer evening, came 4 men in a wagon. 3 of them promptly alighted, and the one who had been driving hitched the team to the only remaining post of what had been a fence. The 4th remained seated in the wagon. "Come," said one of his companions, approaching him, while the others moved away in the direction of the dwelling. "This is the place." The man addressed did not move. "By God," he said harshly, "this is a trick, and it looks to me as if you were in it." "Perhaps I am," the other said, looking him straight in the face and speaking in a tone which had something of contempt in it. "You will remember, however, that the choice of place was with your own assent left to the other side. Of course, if you are afraid of spooks—" "I am afraid of nothing," the man interrupted with another oath, and sprang to the ground. The 2 then joined the others at the door, which one of them had already opened with some difficulty, caused by rust of lock and hinge. All entered. Inside it was dark, but the man who had unlocked the door produced a candle and matches and made a light. He then unlocked a door on their right as they stood in the passage. This gave them entrance to a large, square room that the candle but dimly lighted. The floor had a thick carpeting of dust, which partly muffled their footfalls. Cobwebs were in the angles of the walls and depended from the ceiling like strips of rotting lace, making undulatory movements in the disturbed air. The room had 2 windows in adjoining sides, but from neither could anything be seen except the rough inner surfaces of boards a few inches from the glass. There was no fireplace, no furniture. There was nothing. Besides the cobwebs and the dust, the 4 men were the only objects which were not a part of the structure. Strange enough they looked in the yellow light of the candle. The one who had so reluctantly alighted was especially spectacular. He might have been called sensational. He was of middle age, heavily built, deep-chested and broad shoulders. Looking at his figure, one would have said that he had a giant's strength. At his features, that he would use it like a giant. He was clean-shaven, his hair rather closely cropped and grey. His low forehead was seamed with wrinkles above the eyes, and over the nose these became vertical. The heavy black brows followed the same law, saved from meeting only by an upward turn at what would otherwise have been the point of contact. Deeply sunken beneath these glowed, in the obscure light, a pair of eyes of uncertain colour, but obviously enough too small. There was something forbidding in their expression, which was not bettered by the cruel mouth and wide jaw. The nose was well enough, as noses go. One does not expect much of noses. All that was sinister in the man's face seemed accentuated by an unnatural pallor. He appeared altogether bloodless. The appearance of the other men was sufficiently commonplace. They were such persons as one meets and forgets that he met. All were younger than the man described, between whom and the eldest of the others, who stood apart, there was apparently no kindly feeling. They avoided looking at each other. "Gentlemen," said the man holding the candle and keys, "I believe everything is right. Are you ready, Mr. Rosser?" The man standing apart from the group bowed and smiled. "And you, Mr. Grossmith?" The heavy man bowed and scowled. "You will be pleased to remove your outer clothing." Their hats, coats, waistcoats, and neckwear were soon removed and thrown outside the door in the passage. The man with the candle now nodded, and the 4th man, he who had urged Grossmith to leave the wagon, produced from the pocket of his overcoat 2 long, murderous-looking bowie knives, which he drew now from their leather scabbards. "They are exactly alike," he said, presenting one to each of the 2 principals, for by this time the dullest observer would have understood the nature of this meeting. It was to be a duel to the death. Each combatant took a knife, examined it critically near the candle, and tested the strength of blade and handle across his lifted knee. Their persons were then searched in turn, each by the second of the other. "If it is agreeable to you, Mr. Grossmith," said the man holding the light, "you will place yourself in that corner." He indicated the angle of the room farthest from the door. With the Grossmith retired, his second parting from him with a grasp of the hand which had nothing of cordiality in it. In the angle nearest the door, Mr. Rosser stationed himself, and, after a whispered consultation, his second left him, joining the other near the door. At that moment the candle was suddenly extinguished, leaving all in profound darkness. This may have been done by the draught from the open door. Whatever the cause, the effect was startling. "Gentlemen," said a voice which sounded strangely unfamiliar in the altered condition affecting the relations of the senses. "Gentlemen, you will not move until you hear the closing of the outer door." A sound of trampling ensued, then the closing of the inner door, and finally the outer one closed with a concussion which shook the entire building. A few minutes afterward, a belated farmer's boy met a light wagon which was being driven furiously toward the town of Marshall. He declared that behind the two figures on the front seat stood a third, with its hands upon the bowed shoulders of the others, who appeared to struggle vainly to free themselves from its grasp. This figure, unlike the others, was clad in white and had undoubtedly boarded the wagon as it passed the haunted house. As the lad could boast a considerable former experience with the supernatural thereabouts, his word had the weight justly due to the testimony of an expert. The story, in connection with the next day's events, eventually appeared in the Advance, with some slight literary embellishments and a concluding intimation that the gentleman referred to would be allowed the use of the paper's column for their version of the night's adventure. But the privilege remained without a claimant. 2. The events that led up to this duel in the dark were simple enough. One evening 3 young men of the town of Marshall were sitting in a quiet corner of the porch of the village hotel, smoking and discussing such matters as 3 educated young men of a southern village would naturally find interesting. Their names were King, Sancher, and Rosser. At a little distance, within easy hearing, but taking no part in the conversation, sat a fourth. He was a stranger to the others. They merely knew that on his arrival by the stagecoach that afternoon he had written in the hotel register the name Robert Grossmith. He had not been observed to speak to anyone except the hotel clerk. He seemed, indeed, singularly fond of his own company, or, as the personnel of the Advance expressed it, grossly addicted to evil associations. But then it should be said in justice to the stranger that the personnel was himself of a too convivial disposition fairly to judge one differently gifted, and had, moreover, experienced a slight rebuff in an effort of an interview. "I hate any kind of deformity in a woman," said King, "whether natural or acquired. I have a theory that any physical defect has as correlative mental and moral defect." "I infer, then," said Rosser gravely, "that a lady lacking the moral advantage of a nose would find the struggle to become Mrs. King an arduous enterprise." "Of course you may put it that way," was the reply. "But seriously, I once threw over a most charming girl on learning quite accidentally that she had suffered amputation of a toe. My conduct was brutal, if you like, but if I had married that girl I should have been miserable for life, and should have made her so." "Whereas," said Sancher, with a light laugh, "by marrying a gentleman of more liberal views, she escaped with a parted throat." "Ah, you know to whom I refer. Yes, she married Manton, but I don't know about his liberality. I'm not sure, but he cut her throat, because he discovered that she lacked that excellent thing in woman, the middle toe of the right foot." "Look at that chap," said Rosser, in a low voice, his eyes fixed upon the stranger. That chap was obviously listening intently to the conversation. "Damn his impudence," muttered King. "What we ought to do?" "That's an easy one," Rosser replied, rising. "Sir," he continued, addressing the stranger, I think it would be better if you would remove your chair to the other end of the veranda. The presence of gentlemen is evidently an unfamiliar situation to you." The man sprang to his feet and strode forward with clenched hands, his face white with rage. All were now standing. Sancho stepped between the belligerents. "You are hasty and unjust," he said to Rosser. "This gentleman has done nothing to deserve such language." But Rosser would not withdraw a word. By the custom of the country and the time, there could be but one outcome to the quarrel. "I demand the satisfaction due to a gentleman," said the stranger, who had become more calm. "I have not an acquaintance in this region. Perhaps you, sir," bowing to Sancho, "will be kind enough to represent me in this matter." Sancho accepted the trust, somewhat reluctant, it must be confessed, for the man's appearance and manner were not at all to his liking. King, who during the colloquy had hardly removed his eyes from the stranger's face and not spoken a word, consented with a nod to act for Rosser. And the upshot of it was that, the principals having retired, a meeting was arranged for the next evening. The nature of the arrangements has been already disclosed. The duel with knives in a dark room was once a commoner feature of southwestern life than it is likely to be again. How thin a veneering of chivalry covered the essential brutality of the code under which such encounters were possible, we shall see. In the blaze of a midsummer noonday, the old Manton house was hardly true to its traditions. It was of the earth, earthy. The sunshine caressed it warmly and affectionately, with evident disregard of its bad reputation. The grass greening all the expanse in its front seemed to grow, not rankly, but with a natural and joyous exuberance, and the weeds blossomed quite like plants. Full of charming lights and shadows and populous with pleasant-voiced birds, the neglected shade trees no longer struggled to run away, but bent reverently beneath their burden of sun and song. Even in the glassless upper windows was an expression of peace and contentment, due to the light within. Over the stony fields the visible heat danced with a lively tremor, incompatible with the gravity which is an attribute of the supernatural. Such was the aspect under which the place presented itself to Sheriff Adams and two other men who had come out from Marshall to look at it. One of these men was Mr. King, the sheriff's deputy. The other, whose name was Brewer, was a brother of the late Mrs. Manton. Under a beneficent law of the state relating to property which had been for a certain period abandoned by an owner whose residence cannot be ascertained, the sheriff was legal custodian of the Manton farm, and appurtenances thereunto belonging. His present visit was in mere perfunctory compliance with some order of a court in which Mr. Brewer had in action to get possession of the property as heir to his deceased sister. By a mere coincidence, the visit was made on the day after the night that Deputy King had unlocked the house for another and very different purpose. His presence now was not of his own choosing. He had been ordered to accompany his superior, and at the moment could think of nothing more prudent than simulated alacrity in obedience to the command. Carelessly opening the front door, which to his surprise was not locked, the sheriff was amazed to see, lying on the floor of the passage into which it opened, a confused heap of men's apparel. Examination showed it to consist of 2 hats, and the same number of coats, waistcoats, and scarves, all in a remarkably good state of preservation, albeit somewhat defiled by the dust in which they lay. Mr. Brewer was equally astonished, but Mr. King's emotion is not on record. With a new and lively interest in his own actions, the sheriff now unlatched and pushed open the door on the right, and the 3 entered. The room was apparently vacant. No. As their eyes became accustomed to the dimmer light, something was visible in the farthest angle of the wall. It was a human figure, that of a man crouching close in the corner. Something in the attitude made the intruders halt when they had barely passed the threshold. The figure more and more clearly defined itself. The man was upon one knee, his back in the angle of the wall, his shoulders elevated to the level of his ears, his hands before his face, palms outward, the fingers spread and crooked like claws. The white face turned upward on the retracted neck and had an expression of unutterable fright. The mouth half open, the eyes incredibly expanded. He was stone dead. Yet, with the exception of a Bowie knife which had evidently fallen from his own hand, not another object was in the room. In thick dust that covered the floor were some confused footprints near the door, and along the wall through which it opened. Along one of the adjoining walls, too, past the boarded-up windows, was the trail made by the man himself in reaching his corner. Instinctively, in approaching the body, the three men followed that trail. The sheriff grasped one of the outthrown arms. It was as rigid as iron, and the application of a gentle force rocked the entire body without altering the relation of its parts. Brewer, pale with excitement, gazed intently into the distorted face. "God have mercy!" he suddenly cried out. "It is Manton!" "You are right," said King, with an evident attempt at calmness. "I knew Manton. He then wore a full beard and his hair long. But this is he." He might have added, "I recognized him when he challenged Rosser. I told Rosser and Sancher who he was before we played him this horrible trick. When Rosser left this dark room at our heels, forgetting his outer clothing in the excitement, and driving away with us in his shirt sleeves, all through discreditable proceedings, we knew whom we were dealing with. Murderer and coward that he was." But nothing of this did Mr. King say. With his better light he was trying to penetrate the mystery of the man's death. That he had not once moved from the corner where he had been stationed, that his posture was that of neither attack nor defence, that he had dropped his weapon, that he had obviously perished of sheer horror of something that he saw. These were circumstances which Mr. King's disturbed intelligence could not rightly comprehend. Groping in intellectual darkness for a clue to his maze of doubt, his gaze directed mechanically downward in the way of one who ponders momentous matters, fell upon something which there, in the light of day and in the presence of living companions, affected him with terror. In the dust of years that lay thick upon the floor, leading from the door by which they had entered, straight across the room to within a yard of Manton's crouching corpse, were 3 parallel lines of footprints, light but definite impressions of bare feet. The outer ones those of small children, the inner a woman's. From the point at which they ended they did not return. They pointed all one way. Brewer, who had observed them at the same moment, was leaning forward in an attitude of rapt attention, horribly pale. "Look at that!" he cried, pointing with both hands at the nearest print of the woman's right foot, where she had apparently stopped and stood. "The middle toe is missing. It was Gertrude." Gertrude was the late Mrs. Manton, sister of Mr. Brewer. The end. This has been The Middle Toe of the Right Foot, written by Ambrose Bierce, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original year of publication, 1890. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025, Jonathan Dunne. The Night Wire, written by H.F. Arnold, narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original publication year, 1926. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright, 2025, Jonathan Dunne. New York, September 30th, CP Flash. Ambassador Hollywell died here today. The end came suddenly as the ambassador was alone in his study. There's something ungodly about these night wire jobs. You sit up here on the top floor of a skyscraper and listen in to the whispers of a civilization. New York, London, Calcutta, Bombay, Singapore, they're your next-door neighbours after the streetlights go dim and the world has gone to sleep. Along in the quiet hours between 2 and 4, the receiving operators doze over their sounders and the news comes in. Fires and disasters and suicides, murders, crowds, catastrophes. Sometimes an earthquake with a casualty list as long as your arm. The night wireman takes it down almost in his sleep, picking it off on his typewriter with one finger. Once in a long time you prick up your ears and listen. You've heard of someone you knew in Singapore, Halifax or Paris long ago. Maybe they've been promoted, but more probably they've been murdered or drowned. Perhaps they just decided to quit and took some bizarre way out. Made it interesting enough to get in the news. But that doesn't happen often. Most of the time you sit and doze and tap on your typewriter and wish you were home in bed. Sometimes, though, queer things happen. One did the other night, and I haven't got over it yet. I wish I could. You see, I handle the night manager's desk in a western seaport town. What the name is, it doesn't matter. There is, or rather was, only one night operator on my staff, a fellow named John Morgan, about 40 years of age, I should say, and a sober, hard-working sort. He was one of the best operators I ever knew, what is known as a double man. That means he could handle 2 instruments at once and type the stories on different typewriters at the same time. He was one of the 3 men I ever knew who could do it consistently, hour after hour, and never make a mistake. Generally we used only one wire at night, but sometimes when it was late and the news was coming fast, the Chicago and Denver stations would open a second wire and then Morgan would do his stuff. He was a wizard, a mechanical automatic wizard which functioned marvellously but was without imagination. On the night of the 16th, he complained of feeling tired. It was the first and last time I had ever heard him say a word about himself, and I had known him for 3 years. It was just after 3 o'clock, and we were running only one wire. I was nodding over reports at my desk and not paying much attention to him when he spoke. "Jim," he said, "does it feel close in here to you?" "Why, no, John," I answered, "but I'll open a window if you like." "Never mind," he said. "I reckon I'm just a little tired." That was all that was said, and I went on working. Every 10 minutes or so I would walk over and take a pile of copy that had stacked up neatly beside his typewriter, as the messages were printed out in triplicate. It must have been 20 minutes after he spoke that I noticed he had opened up the other wire and was using both typewriters. I thought it was a little unusual, as there was nothing very hot coming in. On my next trip, I picked up the copy from both machines and took it back to my desk to sort out the duplicates. The first wire was running out the usual sort of stuff, and I just looked over it hurriedly. Then I turned to the second pile of copy. I remember it particularly, because the story was from a town I had never heard of. Zepico. Here is the dispatch. I saved a duplicate of it from our files. Zepico, September 16th. CP Bulletin. The heaviest mist in the history of the city settled over the town at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. All traffic has stopped, and the mist hangs like a pall over everything. Lights of ordinary intensity fail to pierce the fog, which is constantly growing heavier. Scientists here are unable to agree as to the cause, and the local weather bureau states that the like has never occurred before in the history of the city. At 7 p.m. last night, municipal authorities... More. That was all there was. Nothing out of the ordinary at a bureau headquarters, but, as I say, I noticed the story because of the name of the town. It must have been 15 minutes later that I went over for another batch of copy. Morgan was slumped down in his chair and had switched his green electric light shade so that the gleam missed his eyes and hit only the top of the 2 typewriters. Only the usual stuff was in the right-hand pile, but the left-hand batch carried another story from Zepico. All press dispatches come in takes, meaning that parts of many different stories are strung along together, perhaps with but a few paragraphs of each coming through at a time. The second story was marked Add Fog. Here is the copy. At 7 p.m. the fog had increased noticeably. All lights were now visible and the town was shrouded in pitch darkness.
As a peculiarity of the phenomenon, the fog is accompanied by a sickly odour, comparable to nothing yet experienced here.
Below that, in customary press fashion, was the hour, 3:27, and the initials of the operator, J.M. There was only one other story in the pile from the second wire. Here it is.
Second ad, Zeppico, fog. Accounts as to the origin of the mist differ greatly. Among the most unusual is that of the sexton of the local church, who groped his way to headquarters in a hysterical condition and declared that the fog originated in the village churchyard. It was first visible in the shape of a soft grey blanket clinging to the earth above the graves,
he stated.
Then it began to rise, higher and higher. A subterranean breeze seemed to blow it in billows which split up and then joined together again. Fog phantoms, writhing in anguish, twisted the mist into queer forms and figures, and then, in the very thick midst of the mass, something moved. I turned and ran from the accursed spot. Behind me I heard screams coming from the houses bordering on the graveyard. Although the sexton's story is generally discredited, a party has left to investigate. Immediately after telling his story, the sexton collapsed and is now in a local hospital, unconscious.
Queer story, wasn't it? Not that we aren't used to it, for a lot of unusual stories come in over the wire. But for some reason or other, perhaps because it was so quiet that night, the report of the fog made a great impression on me. It was almost with dread that I went over to the waiting piles of copy. Morgan did not move, and the only sound in the room was the tap-tap of the sounders. It was ominous, nerve-wracking. There was another story from Zeppico in the pile of copy. I seized on it anxiously.
New lead, Zeppico Fog, CP. The rescue party which went out at 11 p.m. to investigate a weird story of the origin of a fog which, since late yesterday, has shrouded the city in darkness, has failed to return. Another and larger party has been dispatched. Meanwhile, the fog has, if possible, grown heavier. It seeps through the cracks in the doors and fills the atmosphere with a terrible, depressing odour of decay. It is oppressive, terrifying, bearing with it a subtle impression of things long dead. Residents of the city have left their homes and gathered in the local church where the priests are holding services of prayer. The scene is beyond description. Grown folk and children are alike terrified, and many are almost beside themselves with fear. Mid the wisps of vapour which partially veil the church auditorium, an old priest is praying for the welfare of his flock. The audience alternately wail and cross themselves. From the outskirts of the city may be heard cries of unknown voices. They echo through the fog in queer, uncadenced minor keys. The sounds resemble nothing so much as wind whistling through a gigantic tunnel. But the night is calm, and there is no wind. The second rescue party... More.
I am a calm man, and never in a dozen years spent with the wires have been known to become excited. But despite myself, I rose from my chair and walked to the window. Could I be mistaken? Or far down in the canyons of the city beneath me did I see a faint trace of fog? It was all imagination. In the press room, the click of the sounders seemed to have raised the tempo of their tune. Morgan alone had not stirred from his chair, his head sunk between his shoulders. He tapped the dispatches out on the typewriters with one finger of each hand. He looked asleep. Maybe he was, but no. Endlessly, efficiently, the two machines rattled off line after line, as relentless and effortless as death itself. There was something about the monotonous movement of the typewriter keys that fascinated me. I walked over and stood behind his chair, reading over his shoulder the type as it came into being, word by word. Ah, here was another.
Flash, Zeppico, CP. There will be no more bulletins from this office. The impossible has happened. No messages have come into this room for 20 minutes. We are cut off from the outside, and even the streets below us. I will stay with the wire until the end. It is the end, indeed. Since 4 p.m. yesterday, the fog has hung over the city. Following reports from the sexton of the local church, 2 rescue parties were sent out to investigate conditions on the outskirts of the city. Neither party has ever returned, nor was any word received from them. It is quite certain now that they will never return. From my instrument I can gaze down on the city beneath me. From the position of this room on the 13th floor, nearly the entire city can be seen. Now I can see only a thick blanket of blackness where customarily are lights and life. I fear greatly that the wailing cries heard constantly from the outskirts of the city are the death cries of the inhabitants. They are constantly increasing in volume and are approaching the centre of the city. The fog yet hangs over everything. If possible, it is even heavier than before, but the conditions have changed. Instead of an opaque, impenetrable wall of odorous vapour, now swirls and writhes the shapeless mass in contortions of almost human agony. Now and again the mass parts and I catch a brief glimpse of the streets below. People are running to and fro, screaming in despair. A vast bedlam of sound flies up to my window, and above all is the immense whistling of unseen and unfelt winds. The fog has again swept over the city, and the whistling is coming closer and closer. It is now directly beneath me. God! An instant ago the mist opened and I caught a glimpse of the streets below. The fog is not simply vapour. It lives. By the side of each moaning and weeping human is a companion figure, an aura of strange and vari-coloured hues. How the shapes cling, each to a living thing. The men and women are down, flat on their faces. The fog figures caress them lovingly. They are kneeling beside them. They are, but I dare not tell it. The prone and writhing bodies have been stripped of their clothing. They are being consumed, piecemeal. A merciful wall of hot, steamy vapour has swept over the whole scene. I can see no more. Beneath me the wall of vapour is changing colours. It seems to be lighted by internal fires. No, it isn't. I have made a mistake. The colours are from above. Reflections from the sky. Look up! Look up! The whole sky is in flames, colours as yet unseen by man or demon. The flames are moving. They have started to intermix. The colours rearrange themselves. They are so brilliant that my eyes burn, yet they are a long way off. Now they have begun to swirl, to circle in and out, twisting in intricate designs and patterns. The lights are racing each with each. A kaleidoscope of unearthly brilliance. I have made a discovery. There is nothing harmful in the lights. They radiate force and friendliness, almost cheeriness, but by their very strength they hurt. As I look, they are swinging closer and closer. 1,000,000 miles at each jump. Millions of miles with the speed of light. Aye, it is light, the quintessence of all light. Beneath it the fog melts into a jewelled mist, radiant, rainbow-coloured, of 1,000 varied spectrums. I can see the streets. Why, they are filled with people. The lights are coming closer. They are all around me. I am enveloped. The message stopped abruptly. The wire to Zepico was dead. Beneath my eyes in the narrow circle of light from under the green lampshade, the black printing no longer spun itself, letter by letter, across the page. The room seemed filled with a solemn quiet, a silence vaguely impressive, powerful. I looked down at Morgan. His hands had dropped nervously at his sides, while his body had hunched over peculiarly. I turned the lampshade back, throwing the light squarely in his face. His eyes were staring, fixed, filled with a sudden foreboding. I stepped beside him and called Chicago on the wire. After a second the sounder clicked its answer. Why, but there was something wrong. Chicago was reporting that Wire 2 had not been used throughout the evening. "Morgan!" I shouted. "Morgan, wake up! It isn't true! Someone has been hoaxing us! Why—" In my eagerness I grasped him by the shoulder. It was only then that I understood. The body was quite cold. Morgan had been dead for hours. Could it be that his sensitized brain and automatic fingers had continued to record impressions even after the end? I shall never know, for I shall never again handle the night shift. Search in a world atlas discloses no town of Zepico. Whatever it was that killed John Morgan will forever remain a mystery. The end. This has been The Night Wire, written by H.F. Arnold,
Narrated for you by Jonathan Dunne. Original publication year 1926. This work is in the public domain. Production and narration copyright 2025. Jonathan Dunne. Welcome to Timeless Terrors Volume 5, narrated by Amazon best-selling author Jonathan Dunne. A curated collection of chilling tales from the masters of horror. Inside you will encounter the eerie signal of H.F. Arnold's The Night Wire, the doomed obsession of Edgar Allan Poe's Metzengerstein, and the unsettling antiquarian horrors of H.P. Lovecraft's The Picture in the House. From Ambrose Bierce, experience death that lingers in A Watcher by the Dead and The Middle Toe of the Right Foot. These stories are old, but their fear is timeless. Dim the lights, silence the world, and listen. Production and narration copyright 2025. Jonathan Dunne.